Recently, Rhystic Study has come back into focus as being a particular problem in the Commander format. There's kind of a new emergent deck in the CEDH space, which is Rog Ishai, so playing Rogrek and Ishai as its partner commanders.
And that kind of got us considering, like, what would it take for Wizards to actually ban Rhystic Study? Because this was one of the things that people debated on the last ban and restricted announcement back in February, and nothing really came of it. And in fact, Wizards' official statement basically said they'd have to hear some really strong public opinions before they ended up banning Rhystic Study.
Distraction makers.
Rhystic Study at this point is past the bar for what would constitute a ban in other formats, which is something that got us talking about, like, okay, well, what would it actually take for a card to be banned at this point? If Rhystic Study is not across the line, then would you determine if something, at what point is it across the line?
We're going to go over the parameters that Wizards has publicly set, or the parameters that would be set for something to be changed to a game changer. They haven't been as directly as explicit with what the reasons would be for making something, for banning something. So basically, we're just assuming that whatever these reasons are to turn something into a game changer would just be that and more, or that to a greater extent to ban something. This was somewhat deciphered from the previous, the most recent updates to the ban and restricted list that had some game changer updates, which is allowing players to run away with resources. If a card shifts games in ways that many players find unpleasant, if a card blocks people from playing, if a card efficiently searches for any of their strongest cards without downsides, or if a card is a commander that has a highly unfun play pattern in casual games.
Yeah, which, like, clearly that's pretty subjective, but, like, that's kind of how this format is being managed, right? It's basically saying subjectively, what do we think is the best experience for casual play? And we also have a lot of release valves in case we're sort of wrong, right? One of them being Rule 0, the other one being the Game Changers list. And so they're probably a bit more cavalier about putting things on the Game Changers list instead of banning them. And it might just be that we're in a situation where bans probably are just, like, they might even be off the table at this point, where they have the Game Changers list as a tool to say, hey, these are effectively banned in bracket 2 if you want them, right? If players want this to be banned, then it would be in bracket 2.
Right. And we've kind of talked about, like, we've criticized some of these general philosophies that they've listed and talked about why they're not exactly the most measurable things that you can have. So no one can really be in full agreement on whether something should or should not be banned. But we're mostly going to be talking kind of about, like, the committee structure and how those sort of votes actually get enacted, and fine-tuning that as opposed to fine-tuning the philosophical decisions specifically.
Right. Just sort of creating a system for basically finding sort of like subjective truth rather than like what tournament play would be trying to do, which is sort of objective truth through data, because there really isn't the same kind of data collection, nor would you really want there to be for Commander, I think, right? Like, 60 card competitive, there's the data collection of tournament results, right? Where you're basically saying this is objective truth in that a deck is dominating the metagame. It might not be that is actually the best thing in the meta and that the meta just coalesced around that, but that still is the lived experience of the players, right? Is that deck is overwhelmingly the best thing to be doing, whether that's actually true or not, but that's a whole nother conversation. The other thing that I want to point out here is the reason why the sort of game changer release valve for them instead of bans is still kind of problematic. It moves the problems into the higher brackets, right? Where it's basically saying, we can choose inaction because we have an alternative that is this release valve of Game Changer, which means that players don't experience these things at bracket 2. They experience them less in bracket 3, but brackets 4 and 5 are basically just left on their own if they're not willing to take that step to ban these things. And you sort of end up in this weird scenario where you don't necessarily want CEDH to be its own format and have its own ban list because you want players to be able to move from Commander into CEDH fairly fluidly if that's something that they want to do. But then you're put in a situation where a card like Rhystic Study maybe arguably is fine at lower powered tables, right? Brackets 3 and 4. But at CEDH level, it's extremely problematic. And it's creating like a failed state for the game. Okay, so let's talk about sort of like how the current committee structure works and sort of the positives and negatives that we see about the system currently.
So currently the Commander format panel has 13 members, not including any potential like Wizards employees that might go in and also, facilitate or assist with anything they might need. But
obviously Gavin Valentine is there too, just because he's facilitating the panel.
But those 13 members consist of various content creators / influencers across the space.
I would say that, yeah, the majority of them, if not all of them, are influencers in some capacity. And when we were talking about this, we were sort of like weighing sort of the pros and cons of them, of making a panel up of influencers, right? So first, I think we want to go ahead and steelman the idea that you should have a panel of influencers being the people who are representing or sort of helping to manage the game.
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons why Wizards probably decided that this was the thing to do as opposed to just having a random selection of players. One is that I think at the time they really needed players to get to trust them more. And I think it was easier for them to actually grab content creators and influencers in the space that players could know and trust as opposed to faceless corporate wizards. And it was sort of a direct line, I think, to go and feed into that aspect of what players were looking for. But on top of that, like content creators generally have a very vested interest in making the format good. Like they want the game to be good. They need the game to be good because they rely on that.
Their livelihoods depend on the game being good. Yeah. Player trust thing for Wizards, I think, is a bit outside of like the system itself, but it is an incentive for Wizards of the Coast to do this, right? But that doesn't necessarily like translate into like how the group, the panel manages the format, right? But I agree with you that there's this vested interest of the of influencers to try to make Commander the best game that it can be, even if it's through their own lens of what that is. Again, in the sort of like Wizards category of things that are sort of good for them, it also helps them potentially to get a measure of really invested players, right? Because if you're an influencer who has sort of your finger on the pulse of the invested Commander players that are constantly watching YouTube, commenting on the videos on YouTube and sort of getting opinions in that way, you might have a pretty informed perspective of that particular type of player. That can be a pro Oricon, basically, right? Where basically we're saying influencers have can have a larger representation of the player base than like any random individual player might, right? Because they are sort of theoretically an aggregate of their audiences. Theoretically, it doesn't mean that they're actually operating that way, but there's the potential that they could be.
Yeah, it's difficult because like Commander's always been touted as the casual format and like, you know, stemming from kitchen table magic, and kitchen table magic was always something that like players couldn't get data from it, right? Like they couldn't really have an idea of how many people were actually playing Magic outside of official LGSs and tournaments. And it wasn't until Commander, and in particular Commander influencers and content started popping off, that they were able to get a little bit better data because they were able to follow audiences of these people instead. Yeah. But now that means that data is going to be leaning towards, like you're saying, these highly invested players, where it's like, if you could have a different category of player, it's not just kitchen table and it's not just casual, you have these hyper casual players, which are like incredibly invested players, but they're not playing in the most competitive way. And they might not even be spending the same amount of money that certain other people are playing, but they are consuming this content constantly.
It has created kind of a hardcore casual player. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah. The other thing that I'll bring up about influencers too, along the lines of them sort of having this vested interest in the game being really good, they probably also have a pretty good idea of what makes for good Commander games that are good to watch, right? Where they might be oversensitive to cards that create games that don't move very well, right? Like games that really cards that really bog down a game and lock it into a stalemate. They probably can identify those things pretty well because they probably do so for their content, which is something we've talked about before, where influencers kind of have this incentive to kind of change the way that Magic is being, like Commander is being presented to their audiences, and might be presenting Commander in a better form than what it ultimately actually is played at, which is problematic, but it's also pretty good advertising. So.
No, yeah, it causes a lot of conflict, I think, in how you end up judging something. Is because, yeah, you're going to be looking at a card through multiple different lenses. It's not as easy as being able to look at a card and being able to determine, like, okay, is this better for the healthy state of the game, right? Technically, you'd be given whatever is considered by wizards or even players what a healthy state of the game is, and your goal as someone that is part of that panel is to try and guide decision-making to make sure that you're aiming towards that. But now, if your decision is like a healthy measure of the game could be what is an entertaining game versus like what is a game you can play in, right? And like that's only two of them. I'm sure there's like other things to try and consider, but yeah, trying to look through the lens of a card and think like, okay, is this something that would be entertaining in a game that we're playing, right? Is there a world I could see this being fun? Yes, then it's probably fine, even if that's like not actually the case.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, or even like, do I need to contort myself in the situation to make this fun? Right. But I'm not understanding that I am making that decision consciously. I'm just playing that way, and then the outcome is fun because I'm trying to be entertaining.
This is different from, and oftentimes I think in like a 1v1 sort of a format panel where instead it is just the health of the game, right? It's like, can we measure this against some sort of a measurable quantitative like data, a metric, and decide, is this too much for us?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about some of the cons for the current system. We kind of got into it a little bit already, but yeah, one of the sort of biggest problems we see with the current system, maybe this is a pro and a con. I think it depends on how you want to manage the format. But first and foremost, it seems to be a system that has been designed for indecision, or at least inaction, right? Yeah. Where there's a lot of incentive for people on the format panel to choose to not make a change. This has to do with, one, the blowback that's possible from the audience. Obviously, the types of things that have happened in the past with death threats and things like that are extremely problematic, but you do have to recognize the reality of that situation, and it does have a cooling effect on your ability to manage a format, especially one that's managed on vibes, because you don't have that sort of quantitative, like, hey, look, here is the evidence that we're using to say we need to ban this thing, especially if public opinion is basically saying, hey, don't ban this, when there's, I guess, sort of a minority of players who are being really detrimentally affected by it, which is basically the case with Rhystic Study.
Yeah, and I think in particular, what's I think important to point out here is that the blowback from players, I think, hits influencers a lot harder than it hits wizards. Yeah. And influencers being at the forefront of this panel, I think, kind of puts the target on their back, which I think they wanted to avoid after the original committee's decision with, Jeweled Lotus and Dockside, and that kind of caused this whole thing to shift. But I think that there's still a level of anonymity, which is good because you don't know who, decided one thing or voted for one thing. But like,
as long as it's not only unanimous decision to make a change. Right. Yeah. If their bar to clear is unanimous decision, then just your name being on the format panel means that you voted to ban something. So,
but if something were to go ahead and get voted through and players were not happy, like, we know everyone that, is gonna potentially get death threats from that, which is not good, and I think that that's not to say that Wizards still shouldn't, bring the community and get the community involved and stuff, but having influencers at the forefront, this is a consequence of that.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that the system itself has as sort of a potential problem for inaction is there's a lot of release valves in the current system. You have the game changers list, where basically if something is problematic, you don't need to actually ban it. You can sort of soft ban it in lower brackets, but that doesn't do anything for the higher brackets, which is what's happening with Rhystic Study. But yeah, you kind of have this release valve of, well, we can just make it a game changer and that's good enough. Even when it's not, right? In this current situation, that's basically what we've arrived at.
Yeah, and it's beyond the game changers. Rule 0, and now the bracket system has also kind of become that next thing. That like, if it's not a game changer, well, is there something that we can do within the bracket system, or do we just have that be something that people decide to rule 0 out? Which it feels like they've mentioned rule 0 much less now, which is good. I think they've opted to use the brackets as their sort of de facto replacement for rule 0 conversations.
Well, they even say this is not a substitute for rule 0.
I think I definitely prefer the bracket system over rule 0 conversation. If they're going to try and have any sort of like a half-step decision, like at least there's some sort of hopefully systemic reasoning for why you're categorizing it in one or the other.
And there's at least something to point to that says, hey, it's on the game changers list, where when it's rule 0 and you're using the release valve of it's up to the players to decide what the game is going to look like that they want to play. It's really easy, I think, for you to remove any kind of responsibility from yourself and say, hey, players, if it's up to you to have a good time with these cards, right? And like, I think that's a pretty problematic incentive, especially when it's backed up with this idea that like, yeah, the player base might be mad enough they're going to send you death threats, which again, really problematic, should not be happening. but it is the reality of the situation. Okay, so I think that's sort of the pros and cons of the current system. Obviously, it's the framework that they're working under. It's not perfect, but let's talk about maybe some alternatives or things that different approaches that would still be good at finding sort of subjective truth. I don't think we're ever going to reach the bar of objective truth like we would try to in a competitive format, and I don't really know if that's the right fit anyway for Commander. So
right. I mean, we were talking about this, and I think what we kind of came down to was like some sort of a system similar to having a jury. Having a group of peers that are, semi-randomly selected, narrowed in on, that are then presented an argument or a case for something given by someone that by two different individuals that maybe represent those cases, and then given an amount of evidence have to make a decision. And the thing is like this can still lead to inaction and indecision. However, there's at least this clear bar parameter that has to be met in order to like pass a certain threshold where something has to be done.
Well, yeah, that was something we were kind of talking through with like, well, what if this system worked more like a jury, right? Where you're in a jury system, you have 12 jurors who are supposed to decide the fate of a peer, right, who is being accused of a crime, and that crime must meet the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt. And so the jury decision has to be unanimous in order to cross that bar, which, as you're saying, creates this sort of system where a mistrial is effectively saying not guilty, or at least kicking the can down the road, and a not guilty verdict is not guilty, but a guilty verdict is the only way that you actually end up with somebody who is being convicted of a crime. And so it does put that sort of a higher bar, I guess, on the actual guilty verdict that would imprison somebody, which I think is kind of if your goal is to create a bit of resistance to a banning of a card, this system makes a certain amount of sense. The other thing that's a little bit different here, like you were saying, is the jury is selected randomly from a subsection of the people that you are basically that could have been affected by that crime, right? It's a jury of your peers. They're supposed to be peers that are from the place where the crime was committed, right? Like there's a selection process where the attorneys that are working the case, the prosecution and the defense, get to select juries and put them through a process that attempts to find jurors who are not biased towards certain things that would be very particularly problematic for the case at hand. I don't know exactly what those things would be for something like Rhystic Study. It's like, would you select out CEDH players because, they have an incentive to say, hey, this needs to be banned? Or would you select in for some amount of representation from CEDH because they are a part of that community? But if you're trying to just get sort of like a sample size of the Commander players at large, you would basically find a way to select 12 random people that play Commander, right? Like you wouldn't necessarily look towards influencers specifically because they're going to have particular biases.
Yeah. And I think that I mean, not only the biases that we kind of touched on where it's like you're now leaning towards this sort of new subsect of like hyper casual players.
Yeah.
But the biases of playing for entertainment value, playing for your own sort of personal beliefs. And as opposed to getting, like you said, a random selection of people that it could be, any one reason. But I think the biggest thing here is like you have someone that represents the arguments for these cases, right? As opposed to open public debate where people can present any amount of previous knowledge, experience, their own feelings or opinions. You are having someone it is their sole job to represent this specific case for this. Right. And it does mean that you need to have a strong case, right? It can't just be should Rhystic Study be banned or not? Like that's arguably technically what you're getting at, but there needs to be some sort of a general metric that someone then has in their case against it, right? They can point towards, it's in this many decks. Well, here's this thing Sam Black said, right? Like here's all these arguments that can be used against it as a character to tear it down, and then you can have someone argue against it. And the thing is like chances are the arguments against it in Rhystic Study's case is like, but people like it, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's enough for the jury to be like, okay,
they do. Like it.
They do like it.
obviously we're talking about this from a perspective of like, we're not concerned about the logistics of making this kind of system happen.
No, but you should televise it.
That would be incredible. That would be so good. If you were to do something like this, right? And let's say you invite in someone like Sam Black, who's going to argue that perspective and basically say like, here's why I think Rhystic Study should be banned, and lay out the case. And then you'd have somebody else who is like, I guess, pro Rhystic Study come in and argue the case. And then you have a jury of Commander players who decide yes or no. Or you argue the case and then you send out a survey and have the players decide that way. And that way you have a big swath of players. But you might always just end up at like, oh, maybe, I don't know.
Can we call it card court?
Card court. That's good. Yeah. So this does kind of fix some of the problems with the current system, right? In terms of removing some of the influencer bias. And also, I do wonder if the player base would be more accepting of decisions, because it would be perceived as though it was, as long as it was handled correctly, it would be perceived as like, this is a decision by the players, for the players, right? And not sort of this top down, like, oh, these are all influencers, or this is, people in their tower at Wizards of the Coast, just like, giving down a verdict or whatever. That way it feels like the community is really a part of the process. And I think that's what they're attempting to do with inviting in so many influencers into the current panel, but I don't know if that's actually how people feel about it. And like, I don't know, let us know in the comments, like how you feel about the fact that the current Commander committee panel, the old one was the committee. The Commander format panel is made up almost entirely of influencers. I don't know how players generally feel about that idea. I know how I feel about that idea, but I don't know if most people will see it the same way.
Yeah. What's interesting is that if you were to present something like this, you don't necessarily have to have this overarching philosophy for the format, right? You have an individually decided instance where you're presenting a card or a situation or something, and you're saying, is this thing true? And if this is true, something should be done about it, essentially, right? And so that would be something, if we use 1v1, examples for like ban philosophy, that would be like, is this card creating X situation too frequently, right? And that's how you'd get something like the VV bans, right? Or like, is this creating too stale of a meta, or is this seen in too many decks, etc.? And you can make an argument against that.
So one of the current sort of issues that we're seeing with the current setup is that there isn't much of a sort of format philosophy, or even much of a methodology. I guess maybe more of a philosophy than a methodology, right? Where they're basically saying like, all right, we see this as sort of a casual format, but the stuff's really hard to define. So if you can instead create a system that seeks to find subjective truth, then you don't necessarily need to decide on what the philosophy is. That gets to be determined over time by the players, and you sort of have this system or like rule of law that Magic sort of operates under, and you sort of get established case theory in the same way, where like, hey, we can look back to what happened in the case of banning Rhystic Study to then bring it into the new cases of other cards that might need to be banned. I mean, that's a lot to ask, I think. It's like creating a whole system, but I think it's interesting. It's very fascinating to me.
I think there needs to be some sort of, at least more of a definitive system than there currently is, because it sounds like even now, it's not even a unanimous vote that would have to happen for something to happen. Yeah. It's majority vote for the format panel would have to be in favor for something. And even then, Wizards still gets final decision.
That's a good point.
And like
it's still not objective.
And that's not even what I think people are expecting out of a format panel like this. I think people at the very least are expecting some sort of majority decision. But the fact that Wizards can still sort of be that arbiter for like, nah, we don't want to, just kind of dismisses anything that they would be offering as, an extension of good faith to the players.
Yeah. Okay, so so what are our takeaways here? What do we think that something like this makes sense? Is it feasible? I don't know. Would we implement something like this in one of our own games?
I wouldn't get to this point, but look, they're in a really tough spot, and they're trying to they're treading water, and their arms are getting tired.
Oh my God.
But
the sharks are circling.
Yeah. I mean, they're doing great so far, but I just don't envy the position that they're in. No, I just do something. I think at this point, I'm on the side of the fence that I think I'd rather see change and see them do something, where I think Wizards is thinking, and maybe they have data for this, that most people are like, we don't want any changes. And you know what? Yeah, most people don't want changes. That's just always the case. But I don't know.
Yeah, well, and I do think that you run the risk, right, of alienating a percentage of the player base because of inaction, right? Yeah. And Sam Black brought it up when he was talking about that the idea of CEDH having its own ban list and how problematic that is, but like we might be in a situation where something's got to give, right? Because we've circled back around to this Rhystic Study meta. We were sort of out of it for a while where people were playing Turbo. I still think that Turbo is probably favored in this situation because of the sort of dynamics at the table, but that's a whole nother thing to get into. But yeah, basically, the other thing I'll say about this solution is that it does feel like it feels particularly well suited for like the type of game that Commander has become, right? Like with it being so, I guess what I'm saying is this is a solution that kind of makes for good TV, right? In a way that Commander gameplay also does. Like it feels like a way to engage the audience in a way that they seem to want to be engaged with.
Sure.
Where they are, able to watch this sort of case unfold and then sort of come maybe to their own conclusions about it. But they can see the process, right?
This is what Wizards should do at the next MagicCon. They should have a public,
be so funny.
A public jury
trial,
public trial.
Judge Judy for
certain cards. Whether they actually do something for that or not is kind of besides the point. But I think they should have two representatives of the community. Mark Rosewater and I don't know Gavin Valentine or someone, whoever, making their case to a jury of peers mixed with influencers. Maybe I don't know if you want to have fun with it.
Randomly select people at the convention, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
That's that's your peers, right?
And then just do it. And you know what? I think the spiciest thing would be Soul Ring. I think that would be the thing.
That's an interesting one. That's an interesting one. You'd have to tell the people arguing it ahead of time and stuff, but so I can prep their case.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah.
If
you enjoyed listening to us talk about the committee and why nothing really happens in Commander anymore, please feel free to give us a like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If you want to continue the conversation, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.